Somehow, I was more disheartened by what the effect might be on the people that did the experiments, rather than the isolated fetuses. Though not a religious person in a conventional sense, I was afraid that these acts were assaults upon all of us. For whatever is intrinsically good and ordered for us, I was afraid of the callous disregard for our life that I sensed might cumulatively accrue with the increase of abortion and experimental feticide. The more routine these became, the easier they would be to accept. And I was painfully aware that in an overpopulated world, there were millions of instances where prenatal death might be preferable to some of the lives of endless hunger, disease, and disillusionment. But I wondered if a world which couldn't provide a better solution to its problems than the mass slaughter of the unborn would be worth living in any event. Pretty poignant, right? I was asked where I thought life began. I didn't know. The man who came to see me didn't know. He wished that some of his colleagues, who seemed to be quite definite about the origins and had unflappable convictions, would share with the rest of us. Some said the moment of conception. Others had no doubt that it was the moment of implantation. Others said that it was the development of the heart and vital organs. Some pointed to the third trimester. Others said the moment of birth. And still a few more said when the twinkle appeared in the eye. These were important because my doubts about cloning concern the issue of bench embryos. These are fertilized cells, experimentally conceived in laboratories, and then sacrificed in the process of whatever research procedure was at hand. In vitro means in test tube, and at this time, conceptions were very much in the news. All researchers all over the world were attempting to be the first to combine the human eggs with sperm in a laboratory container and implant into a woman's womb. So a couple of British researchers that were excited about what they were doing and wanted to create test tube babies began examining individual cells under a microscope to discover their sex and then implanting the sex into the child. They called it jettisoning, or so they threw some down the toilet, meaning they flushed the ones that they didn't want. It seemed to me at that time that there was an unconscionable disregard for what might well be human life, and a disregard exercised in this instant in pursuit of something as trivial as giving prospective parents the sex they want. I wondered if this was substantially different from the old days when unwanted girl babies were left on mountaintops to die. There would no doubt be bench embryos on the way to cloning the first man. The procedure, as it had been worked out in animals, demanded that a body cell nucleus containing a full set of chromosomes be implanted in an egg cell, the nucleus of which had been destroyed. The resulting embryo would in turn be implanted into the uterus of a woman. Dozens, even hundreds of these doctored embryos might have to be created in the laboratory before one would do what it was supposed to do, the egg cell accepting a foreign nucleus, and continue to divide and ultimately produce an identical copy of the cloned individual. In theory, it might work the first time, but it most certainly would not, and there would be problems, and refinements would be required. Embryos that didn't work out or measure up would be jettisoned or flushed. That was to look at the worst faces of it. In another mood, I said, I could easily argue that ends can and often do justify the means, and sometimes they're unpleasant and even brutal. My friend called me a situational consequentialist. Was that bad? He said that he would call himself the same thing, a person who weighs the pros and cons of each situation and decides whether the good outweighs the bad in each individual case. In this case, for example, an ethical consequentialist decision would have to take into account the man who wanted to be cloned, his personality, character, and quality would affect not only the resulting clone, but ultimately perhaps the whole world. It would also involve, he indicated, an assessment of the consequences of this act upon the future of scientific research. Right? I guess forwarding it, which seems to be inevitable. My friend had been cautious throughout our conversation, said John, but now he allowed himself one opinion, and he labeled it to the effect that he was not in sympathy with those of his colleagues who maintained that human desire was of no importance or insufficient to justify, for example, test tube fertilization techniques aimed at overcoming otherwise irreversible infertility. Most of those doing the belittling had children of their own, he said, but added that, given their low regard for human desire, he wondered about the psychological sterility of their lives. Desire, he said, making his understatement evident by his tone, was not the least important of all human emotions. Without it, we would be stagnant, cease to exercise our wills, and thus, in a sense that was very real to him, cease to be human. He wished me good luck, and I knew he meant it. I came away from that conversation feeling that, in the view of an individual respected not only by myself, but also by many of his peers, an act of human cloning might not necessarily be irresponsible or morally reprehensible. I came away from it, moreover, reflecting on our Promethean universe, a world in which we must exercise the will that distinguishes us as a species. But in order to do so, we must constantly test the fates. We must steal fire from heaven and then hope that molten lava isn't rained down upon us in eternal retaliation. Pretty interesting and food for thought.